It's time for On the Farm in Alabama, bringing farmers and agribusiness the latest news from Alabama Extension and the Auburn University College of Agriculture. Now here's your host, Alabama Extension Regional Agent, Eddie McGriff.
I'd like to welcome everybody today to On the Farm, and today as my special guest I have Dr. Ron Smith, and we're going to be remembering and celebrating his near half-century career with the Alabama Extension as their cotton entomologist. Ron, we're filming today in Coleman. It's my hometown, and you were raised in neighboring Lawrence County, Moulton, and our families share similar backgrounds in that my grandfather was a tenant cotton farmer. My dad grew up during the Depression, World War II, the 50s on a cotton farm, and my grandfather quit farming in the early 60s. He farmed his whole life with mules and picked the cotton by hand, and I know that your family was similar. And I'd like you to tell us a little bit about growing up on a cotton farm in the 50s in Alabama.
All right, well, good. Yeah, let me just go back and even begin before then. My grandfather moved from Blount County over to Lawrence County about 1921, and they were sharecroppers then. That's what a lot of people did at that time. And then later, both he and my dad bought farms, and actually we bought our farm that I grew up on in 1941, and we're growing cotton then up until about 1963, and we might touch on that 63 later. But anyway, we small family farm, grew cotton primarily, grew some corn to feed our mules, and everything was by horsepower then, or mule power. We didn't have a tractor on the farm at all, and everything was done by hand. And most farms in the community where I grew up, they grew enough cotton, whatever they could get harvested in the fall by the family and maybe a few neighbors, or a grandfather or a grandmother or an aunt or uncle would also help pick at harvest time. But it was a great life. I remember going to the field and starting to pick cotton when I was about 5, and I was told later that I could pick 100 pounds a day back then, so that was really a help to the family. And so that was all we knew, and that would have been then in the late 40s, Eddie, even before we got to the 50s. But definitely in the 50s, it was just work on the farm. But looking back, that was a real pleasant time, because it gave your brain a lot of time to think about the future and everything like that. But so we farmed that way, and all the way through high school, and actually we were continuing to farm through a couple of years of college before we actually got out of farming in about 1963.
Well, Ron, I don't think people realize how tough it was picking cotton by hand, because I've done it before, and those burrs are sharp and they'll cut you up pretty bad.
Well, yeah, and I remember my mom particularly, she would put masking tape on her fingers, but just like going barefooted in the summer, Eddie, your soles of your feet got tough, so in the fall your fingers just got a little tougher to compensate for the burrs, because they never bothered me at all. I mean, some of them were sharp. Some varieties actually had sharper burrs than others. I kid my folks nowadays that my dad wouldn't plant Delta pine cotton because they had sharper burrs than Stoneball. And if you planted Delta pine, you couldn't get anybody to want to pick for you. You know, if you planted Stoneball, the burrs were not as bad, and you could get hand labor a lot easier.
About how many acres of cotton did your family pick or have?
Well, I was thinking of that just recently. We would have several little fields. I think our largest field might have been 10 acres, and then we would go down the road or across the way a little ways sometimes, and we'd rent a 4-acre field here or a 4-acre field there on another farm. So probably 10 to 15 acres would be a normal year, and then you pick basically from the time we started. You know, back at that time, school would let out, you'd start back after the summer break. You'd start back in around a little after the 1st of July. You'd go 6 weeks or so, and it'd be undetermined, but they would go by when the cotton opened as to when they let out, and then they let out for 6 or 8 weeks in the fall so everybody could pick. And then the town people didn't like that, so we modified it. We would start school at 7, and we'd get out at noon and come home, and we'd pick in the afternoon. So that was a more modern day time before all that era ended. And we didn't make a lot of pictures of that period because we thought it would last forever, and it was hard work, but everybody was doing it, so you just had to do it. That was your income. And so we would work year round, and it was always something to do on the farm at that time.
I remember that my dad telling me about the lightning striking the school here in Berlin, and my uncle, his older brother, hated going to school, and the school burned down, so they couldn't go to school, and my grandfather had him in a pick sack and brought him out to the field. He wasn't so happy then.
Well, we all worked, and my sisters, I was the oldest in the family, and my sisters and so forth would help, and so you just worked till you got through. We would start picking every year around Labor Day, and at that time, if you're hand harvesting, you can go out and start picking before it's all open. So you'd go over it the first time, and then by that time you'd be double back because more bowls would open, and then maybe you'd pick through that time, and then the last time was what we'd call scrapping. So you'd just get the few remaining bowls that's left. By that time you'd be over into November sometime.
What kind of yields were you looking at?
That's a real good question. Now, it depended on 2 things. Depending on the rainfall during the summer and how cold the previous winter was, because that dictated how many boll weevils there were out there. And the colder the winter, the fewer the weevils. So if you had few weevils in good rainfall, we was picking more than a bale per acre. In fact, I think we had a few fields that would go on pushing 2 bales back then, but that was very unusual. The typical yield around was everybody hoped for a bale.
One thing people don't realize, but if you go look up in North Alabama, you'll see the skeletons or remnants of all the old gins. Most of them have been torn down, but there's still a lot of the old gins around. Every community had a gin.
Well, you had to have a gin because you pulled your cotton to the harvest to be ginned on a wagon with mules. A few people might have pickup trucks, and they could put a bale on the back if they made the sideboards in the back real tall. But so you couldn't go 5 miles. But our nearest gin when I was young was a steam-driven gin, and it was probably about 1.5 miles away. They eventually went out of business, and we went to another gin, and it was about 3.5 or 4 miles away, but we still went on a gravel road pulled by horse and wagons, and that gin was run by a big diesel motor, and we could hear that gin from our house, so that's how noisy it was.
I wanted to talk a little bit about farming with mules instead of a tractor. Hemingway said that a mule will labor for you for 20 years just for the opportunity to kick you one time. So I want to know, what was it like to work with mules?
Well, it depends on, normally you work with a pair,
Yeah.
and it depends on how well they work together. A few things I remember is they would always really mope when they were going away from the barn to the other end of the field. You really had to push them to get them to pull the plow out there. On the way back, they would go too fast because they thought every row, every round, because you normally was just doing it, cultivating 1 row at a time. But they thought every row was going to be the last one, so they would hurry to the barn. And then when you got at lunchtime, you would unhitch them and feed them a few nubbins, little sorry ears of corn, and then take them over to the pond and water them and bring them back after lunch and hitch them up again and go for the afternoon. But if both pulled equally, then it worked pretty good. But if you had one that pulled better than the other one, everything was kind of lopsided all day.
Yeah. You know, when I started out as a county agent in the early 80s, all the older farmers told me about the drought of 1954, and that was one of the worst droughts in the southeast. And I know you remember it.
Yes, and there was an event that happened that summer that's the reason I remember that, and I don't remember it being that dry. Maybe we've had drier years, but that was one that stands out. That's one we compare all our dry years now back to. But the thing that I remember is we had a little stock pond or pond for our cows. Everybody had a few milk cows too at that time. And our neighbor on the farm had some goldfish, and they were the color that you see in aquariums now, but they would get quite large, maybe a half a pound or so. But we would catch them out of his pond and put them in our pond. Well, anyway, that year the pond went dry, and when it got down to just a puddle in the middle, we just rolled up our pants leg and got in there barefooted and caught those fish out because they were going to die as it dried on up. We put them in a tub, and we had the tub on a ground slide, which is the way you moved your equipment from one field to the other, particularly if you had to go on a gravel or paved road. And so we put the tub, put some water in it, went over to the pond, got the fish out, and we had one old mule that was kind of crippled, and I think old Shorty was his name. But anyway, we had him hitched up, and we took that ground slide in the tub about a half mile away to my granddad had a watering tank for his stock that he kept water in out of the well. So we put all our fish in there, was going to preserve them. And he forgot and left the water running one night, and I guess water coming out of the well was too cold, so all our fish died anyway. Mm-hmm. But anyway, that's how I remember the summer. But now, if we've got time, let's tie into this cold weather.
Well, we definitely want to talk about that, because the colder the winter back then, the better the potential of cotton yield, because you kind of knocked out your boll weevils.
Yeah, and that was the dominant pest back then. Everything else would kind of balance out. Bollworms were really not much of a problem, and we did have beneficial insects. We didn't do a lot of spraying, but that time the spraying was in the form of dusting, because all the insecticides were in the form of a powder. DDT and toxaphene were two of the primary ones at that time. But anyway, the boll weevils would overwinter real well in mild winters, and it would just dominate the crop early on. And if we had a real cold winter, it would be August before they would build up to damaging numbers. So it bought you about 30 extra days of producing cotton without having to spray. The winter of 62 and 63, there was events in December and January, December 62 and January 63, where it went into single digits 3 times during that 2-month period. And summer of 63, we did not have any boll weevils to speak of until way on into August, when the crop was almost mature. Unfortunately, I got caught again on the wrong side of that deal, because I had a project at Auburn that I needed to collect boll weevils, and it was August before I had to find 10 weevils. And I was a cotton scout that summer, and I couldn't find my 10 weevils till August. So that set everything back a ways.
You were talking about going to Auburn. How did you decide you were going to go to Auburn, and how did you decide you were going to go into entomology?
Well, yeah, that's a good bit of a story there too. When we had career day in high school, I shadowed the county agent, so I was always interested in agriculture, and I was always interested in going to Auburn. But we had some sickness in the family at that time, and it was better that I not go there directly. So I actually went over to Florence State at that time, UNA now, and went 2 years there, taking courses that would transfer to Auburn. So I made it to Auburn as a junior in 63. And was interested in agriculture. And as to how I got in entomology, the county agent had told my dad that if I had the economic entomology course taught by F.E. Guyton, that I could get a job the next summer as a cotton scout. So I really hurried to get into his last course that he taught before he retired, and had the course in the spring, and was a cotton scout in 63. And the evolution on into entomology was really a little bit later, and not necessarily dictated on that, but when I got my BS degree, I decided I wanted to go ahead and get my master's while I was in school, and I went into agronomy because a lot of the courses in the ag science curriculum were real suited to go into agronomy, and so I got my master's in agronomy. And at that time, I got out and I'd worked a while with a couple of other, one federal agency and one fertilizer company. And it's just that I had had some entomology courses, and the people in entomology were just downright more like everyday people, and I got along better with them. So when I went back to school for my PhD, then I decided that I wanted to do entomology, and that's got me into the business. And eventually I got back to Auburn as the cotton entomologist in '72.
Well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in On the Farm today, and we're going to have Ron back with us on the next episode, and we're going to be talking about his career as a cotton entomologist with Alabama Extension at Auburn University. Thank you, Ron.